So thank you so much, Jim, for the opening remarks. What we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the circular economy in a debate that is not with like the GOP debates with circular logic. So it's good to get a break from politics and to talk about an issue that is really important. And so what we would do, we're going to have opening remarks just from the chairs here casually from both John and Adam, and I think we'll start with John and then we'll dig into the questions where I get to drive. Usually I'm being asked the questions. Today I get to ask them. So go ahead.
Thanks very much, Dana, and thanks very much for coming. I'm honored to be here. And as someone who's criticized recycling, I want to start with two concessions. First of all, those of you in the recycling business, I will readily concede that you are more popular than I am. You know, after that, among the hate mail that I got, there was a box of garbage, you know, from readers. And when they were talking earlier about you're getting the Tiger Woods of these issues, I was thinking more like Darth Vader would be more like it. So, and I also readily concede that recycling, you know, does make sense for some materials at some times in some places. And my problem is with what I call the recycling religion. The idea that recycling is this inherently virtuous activity, that the more we do of it, the better, and that the ultimate goal should be achieving zero waste. And I think that Jim and David Steiner, you know, have raised the issue very well in saying, you know, what is the goal here? And if you go back to the origins of this philosophy, the modern philosophy, it's really back in the 1970s when oil prices were skyrocketing and there were natural resources were skyrocketing, and most experts were absolutely sure that we were running out of natural resources. There were articles, you know, in the New York Times about the new age of scarcity. There were bestsellers, The End of Affluence. And it seemed natural that, you know, we had to basically, you know, recycle these things because we're running out. And this belief, it feels right. I mean, this fear, there's a lot of intuitive appeal to it because the world's population is growing every year. There's a finite amount of metal in the ground. Shouldn't we run out? It makes intuitive sense. The problem is it's contradicted by thousands of years of history. That for thousands of years, the real cost of natural resources has been declining. And there are occasional price spikes, there are occasional shortages, but what happens is that we find new supplies because of the new price incentives, or we find substitutes. And back in the 1940s, there were best-selling books, it was sort of the forerunner of the environmental movement, called Our Plundered Planet and The Road to Ruin. And they were saying that basically that we're running out of tin and copper. They predicted there were soon going to be wars fought over tin. And there were these calls that we had to recycle these things and ration them because future generations were not going to have tin cans for food. They wouldn't be able to make telephone calls. Well, what actually happened, of course, is that we didn't go to war over tin. You know, the copper and tin prices, I think, are terrible right now. That food containers are not, as Jim said, they're not made of tin anymore. Telephone calls mostly don't go through copper wires. They go through fiber optic cables made of sand. And if the world ever runs out of sand, which I'm not that worried about, we can make wireless calls. So that's the long-term history of natural resources. And people found this out in the 1980s and 90s when, you know, oil prices and other resource prices plummeted again. So at that point, though, this religious belief in recycling, that it was good, it became what I like to think of as a solution in search of a problem. Because, you know, once you had the idea of natural resources weren't running out, then, you know, why are we recycling? And the next big problem that it found was vanishing landfills. That became the big news in 1989, 1990, and there was this widespread belief, fanned by my irresponsible colleagues in the media, I'm not proud of us, that we're running out of landfill space. And so the federal government set this goal of 25% national recycling rate. Cities like New York adopted very ambitious recycling programs with, you know, clearly predicting we're going to save money on this because landfill space is going to be so expensive, this is going to be a great savings for us. But this belief never, this fear never made any sense. I mean, the United States, if you think of the United States as a football field, all the garbage that Americans will generate for the next 1,000 years would fit between the goal line and the 2-inch line. And once you put it there, you just cover it up and it becomes a park or a golf course. So the great landfill shortage never materialized, and cities like New York lost an awful lot of money. New York lost at least $1 billion, probably closer to $2 billion by recycling instead of saving money. So after that justification disappeared, then the latest problem for which recycling is touted as the solution is global warming. And this problem has the advantage that it's real. Global warming is a real problem, and recycling can indeed contribute to solving that problem by reducing carbon emissions. But I think that people often have an exaggerated idea of how much good it can do. One example I like to give is that if you wanted to offset the carbon emissions of a flight from New York City to London, a round-trip flight, you would have to recycle 40,000 plastic bottles. And you have to be sure not to rinse them with hot water, because if you rinse them with hot water, you may actually be adding carbon to the atmosphere. So the benefits of recycling are often expensive, and especially, as Jim said, once you move beyond paper, metals, and some kinds of plastic, the benefits really start disappearing. For glass especially, it takes, you have to recycle 3 tons of glass to get 1 ton of carbon. Of course, it's very expensive. So I think that recycling faces, in the long haul, 2 difficult trends. One, as I mentioned, is that natural resource prices tend to decline over time in real dollars. The other is that the one thing that does increase over time, that's been increasing for centuries, is the cost of labor and of people's time. So to the extent that you're using a lot of labor to process materials that are becoming increasingly less valuable, it's hard to make recycling work. Now, I know a lot of people in this room are working on ways to make it more efficient. There are things like single stream that reduce the amount of labor that citizens have to put into it. And so there are ways, I think, that recycling can become more automated, more efficient, and it'll be possible to recycle more materials. But for now, I think it's better to concentrate on those materials that Jim mentioned. And I think that we should be very wary of politicians who are setting arbitrary goals of 50, 75% or zero waste. Now, as I say, I'm not a politician, and I'm not very popular, as I've conceded, so I'm not expecting recycling to disappear. I really think that the recycling religion is going to persist because it fulfills other needs other than economic and environmental. It's a ritual of atonement for people who feel guilty about being affluent. It's a sacrament, really. And my favorite explanation for recycling comes from a book it's a book about consumer passions by James Twitchell, very smart guy. And the book is titled Lead Us into Temptation. And he says that most of us like to think that we're not grubby materialists. We don't need a lot of stuff. We have very exalted goals that matters to us. But we think that we're wedded to responsible consumption. But we actually do a lot of philandering. And at the end of the week, when we see that pile of trash in the garbage or in the garage, it makes us feel guilty because we realize that that actually we are conducting this kind of secret love affair with stuff. And the trash is the lipstick on the collar that gives us away. Mm-hmm. And I think the reason a lot of people want to keep recycling is it's our way of saying, I'm sorry, honey. That's it.
As someone who suffers from trash anxiety, I think that's an interesting point. Adam, you have some opening remarks for us?
I do. Very happy to be up here with you, Dana and John. And speaking as a journalist, and I think John understands this, it's a real honor to be #1 in terms of hate mail at your publication. So I aspire to achieving something similar at some point. Anyway,
You could write about Donald Trump. That'll help.
that's actually not bad.
Believe me.
Let me tell you, writing about China has its hazards as well. But anyway, recycling is not new. And whenever I talk to groups about recycling, I'm always stunned by how people seem to think that it was invented in the 1970s. Of course, it wasn't invented in the 1970s. So long as people have been making things, they've been reusing things. Why do they reuse things? Because it's efficient. If you have something that had work go into it, that had energy inputs go into it, generally speaking, of course, there's going to be exceptions, it's efficient, it's economically efficient, and we'll get to the environmental side of this, to reuse that. I always like to use the example of automobile motors. Most of the motors in this country, the engine blocks now, are made from aluminum. That aluminum is usually almost uniformly, both in the United States and overseas, recycled aluminum. Why? Well, because it's an alloy. So if you could have a bunch of shredded cars, a bunch of old cars that already have this alloy in them, why wouldn't you just remelt that? Instead of going and digging up zinc, digging up zinc, digging up bauxite, and going through the trouble of all the energy inputs that go there. So this is not a new idea. In the United States, we've been recycling since we've been the United States. America's most famous recycler, of course, is Paul Revere. He'd run around buying the old silver and metal from his neighbors and make it into, multi-million-dollar tea sets, at least they are now. In the 19th century, the United States began importing vast amounts of steel from the UK. It's an interesting story. People think waste and recycling as a globalized market only happened recently, but in fact, it goes back to the mid-19th century because even though there was a lot of iron ore in the ground in the United States, there wasn't, you had to turn it into that. It required energy input and work, so we imported steel, and we also imported vast amounts of clothing. Why import clothing? To some extent it was to reuse the clothing, and to some extent it was to make paper. And so for many, many years in the 19th century, British clothing was a big source of US paper. So this idea that there's economic value in this industry has always been around. And despite the fact that you get fluctuations in the price of commodities, despite the fact that we are always finding new sources of raw materials, because we alloy, because we very rarely use these things just as they come out of the ground, the value is there, the efficiency is there. I don't have the data showing that you see this continual decline in the value of commodities, but to an extent that doesn't matter because it's not about the overall decline in the value of commodity, it's actually the margin, and can you make that margin? And that's something that the recycling industry, I think, deals with on a regular basis. So it's efficient, it will always be economically efficient, and what happened in the 1970s was really sort of a latecomer to this economic party, this very profitable party that had been going on for a long time. So, that's one thing that I like to start out by talking about is that if you don't sort of get your hands around the history of this industry and why it happened, you're sort of losing some of the narrative. Landfills. Landfills always come up when we discuss recycling for very obvious reasons. And, I think we've been landfilling for as long as humanity's been recycling. That'd be an interesting question. Which came first, the junkyard or the landfill? And, we can maybe leave that for the discussion. We are not running out of landfill space in theory, but in practice we are. When Fresh Kills closed, there's plenty of space in New York City to put in a new landfill. If I, go to Google Maps and I look down on New York City, there's that big park in the middle of it in Manhattan. It's perfect for a landfill. I mean, you got all the roads going into the middle. Well, anybody here want to see a landfill in the middle of Central Park? Of course not. Show of hands, who wants a landfill in their community? The waste management people do not get to raise their hands. You don't. And that's the thing. New York City doesn't have a landfill. There are no landfills in New Jersey, and so what's happening? You have New York City sending its garbage, around the East Coast. It goes as far south as South Carolina, 650 miles. Now, you could say, well, that's great, the South Carolinians want that, but do they? You just recently had a lawsuit in South Carolina against the Bishopville landfill down there. The folks are very upset about the odors. They've been upset for a very long time. So you could say, well, we have plenty of landfill space, but I think the more important question is, do we have a lot of landfill space that people are going to be okay with? Is, and the folks at Waste Management, will know this better than I do. Whenever you want to site a landfill, you're going to have problems. There are going to be people who are upset about it. So then the question is, what do you do? What's your alternative? Well, we're still going to have landfills. I'm not a believer in zero waste. I don't think it's achievable. But then the question is, where is that excess waste going to go, whether it's glass or something else? Not such an easy question. And so I think when we talk about these things, we have to deal with that fact. It's not enough to say there's plenty of landfill space, because there isn't. Because nobody raised their hand when I asked if you wanted a landfill next to your home, even if it's going to generate large amounts of property taxes and maybe be turned into a park at some point. So what are then the benefits of recycling that go beyond the economics of it? I think that's a very important question. We sometimes talk about the economics and the environmental ideas as if they're separate. I grew up in a junkyard, quite literally. I mean, if you're not familiar with my book, I grew up in the industry. And one of the things that's very important to me is, as somebody who grew up in the scrap side of the business, is that you find the value in it. Meaning you find economic value. But that doesn't mean I don't appreciate the environmental value. We just heard from Mr. Fish that there are greenhouse gas savings within all of these materials, inherently, including the plastics. I think that's right, and I think there's an argument to be made that there's a compelling social interest in this, and I think we've all agreed on that. I mean, nobody, I think, likes global warming. Well, if you don't like global warming, what are you going to do about it? The government already mandates various measures to make sure that we pollute less. We don't have the carbon taxes yet. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. But of course, we had the Clean Air Act, and that reduced pollution. So this is not so unusual, the idea that we should spend money, whether it's whether it's coming out of a municipality or out of Waste Management's pockets or whoever, to actually achieve environmental goals. And I think that's very reasonable. I just want to wrap up on John's point about the religion of recycling. This is something that we actually agree on to some extent. I actually, in some of my talks, refer to recycling as expatiation for original consumer sin. So, it's the same idea. But where I differ from you on this is that I see it not as a problem, but as actually an opportunity. At the end of Junkyard Planet, I talk about a study, and it's a wonderful study, and it gets at what the problem is here. A couple of social scientists in the Midwest went into a men's restroom. Really, stay with me for a second here. And they took a waste bin and put it beneath the paper towel rack. And for a few weeks, they measured how many paper towels went in there. Then they slapped a sticker on it that said recyclable. Well, guess what happened? You had more paper towels go in if you had recyclable on there. That's a problem. I mean, no matter how you look at recycling, except for my friend, I'm not actually going to say who this is, but I know a paper recycler in Texas who said, I love that story. I'm going around putting recycling symbols on waste bins. But that's a genuine problem, because it's a failure of education. But the opportunity is, it says that people have actually got this ethos in their head. There's a lot of talk about whether we can do single sort, whether we can clean the contamination. Well, if this has become a kind of civic religion, then it seems to me that there's actually, if you will, a gospel, an opportunity to actually bring people up in terms of their recycling habits. And so, instead of looking at it as a problem, if we really do have this civic religion, then I think that's something to be taken advantage of. And it's something that companies and municipalities and big corporations can take advantage of to actually improve recovery rates, but most importantly, to get rid of the trash and contamination within the recycling.
All right. I'm just going to ask, is it Anita? You here or something? Could you just I don't have a clock here, so just let me know when I have 10 minutes to go before we go to the Q&A, because we're going to have about 15 minutes at the end here where we can take questions from you, but I will get it started here. This is a question I'd like both of you to answer, and it's about greenhouse gas emissions, because you mentioned it as well. Because dealing with that problem is going to require lots of small actions by individuals and average Americans, but also all around the world. And I'm interested in your perspective of what's happening in Asia, because if global warming is indeed a global problem, can it just be solved by possibly expensive solutions in the United States? And how do we try to think about recycling going forward, especially with the commodity prices being what they are?
I agree with you that, I think that in the larger scheme of things, once you get beyond paper and metals, that all the stuff that's recycled in the United States every year amounts to, I think it's 0.2% of the national carbon footprint. And of course, on a global scale, when you compare it with the global carbon footprint, it's not really doing that much. I mean, I think recycling tends to be more of a feel-good thing than actually accomplishing very much. And I think you can argue on the other side that people feel that they're doing something. I recycled that plastic bottle, so I therefore can, take my, have my country home and fly to Europe, which of course have much more impact. So in that sense, I don't know that, I mean, for some things, as Adam says, that it does make economic sense to do it, and I think it's good, but I think it's a pretty expensive way. And if you ever factor in, which no one ever does on the economics, how much time it takes people to sort things and do all that. Now some of that's diminishing because it's single sort, but if you add in a lot of that time that people are spending doing it, it becomes a really expensive way to reduce carbon.
All right, I was curious, from your perspective in Asia, what you are witnessing there.
Yeah, it's a very interesting situation in China in particular right now. And John had mentioned the rising cost of labor as being something that works against recycling. When I first started reporting on recycling in China in 2002, it was all about hand labor. And you can see pictures in my book, and you can see these not just from me, but people on the ground actually hand sorting through recyclables. When I first got to China in 2002, the average price of labor in a recycling workshop in Shanghai was around $100 per month. It's now around $600 per month, which is extraordinary. I mean, in about a 13-year period. But what's interesting about that is that even though you're getting a rising cost of labor, you're actually, in these sorting facilities, getting a higher efficiency. And you can find this out by just simply talking to the recyclers themselves. How are they doing this? Well, you're actually seeing technology moving in to the recycling systems across China. And you're also starting to see it in India. I was just in India 3 weeks ago looking at Indian aluminum recycling operations, and the same thing is happening there. So even though you have steep rising costs of labor, especially in China, but also in India, they're actually dealing with this by adding technology. Now, why are they doing this? Why the devotion? Well, one, as I said, it's economically efficient. There's a profit to be made there, even with the commodity prices down. 1/3 of China's plastics, and that's the largest plastics manufacturer in the world, are made from recycled resins. That's amazing. So there's an economic incentive. But in China in particular, there is also the environmental incentive. There's a lot of discussion about whether China's really serious about its climate change commitments. What I'm seeing within the recycling space is they are, because there's been the decision at the central government level that one of the ways they're going to achieve carbon reductions is by expansion of the recycling industry, specifically steel, aluminum, and paper. They haven't put their focus on plastics yet, but I think that will be coming. But there's actually projections, and there's actually been calculations that they're starting to circulate through the state media saying this is one of the primary routes that we're going to use to actually lower our carbon intensity in this country, and it's happening.
When you talk about jobs, because you mentioned the jobs and the wages, I mean, that's true in America as well. And John, I'm curious what you think in terms of the industry. As I understand from, let's see, there's $106 billion in annual economic activity, responsible for about 472,000 direct and indirect jobs, and $4.3 billion in state and local revenues, and another almost $7 billion in federal taxes. And so the government does tend to get addicted to that kind of revenue, but yet the costs are rising. And so I wonder if you can talk about that, how we should rationalize
the government
that.
gets some revenue from it, but the government, these municipal governments are also paying very high bills to recycle stuff. The cost, I mean, New York City spends a lot more money every year because of recycling that's less available. There is the argument about that recycling creates jobs, but in a way that's a measure of inefficiency. When you're spending a lot more people to do the job that could be done with less, that's money that could be spent something else on cancer research or so simply creating, I mean, it's been said that like we could create a lot of jobs if people just dumped all their trash out in the middle of the street and we hired people to go pick it up. You have a lot of jobs, but you wouldn't be creating any value.
Do you say that as an additional incentive besides the consumer preference and the environmental benefits, but from an industry standpoint?
Well, yeah, I mean, especially, if you're going to compare recycling to landfilling, I mean, there's obviously going to be more employment involved. I mean, a landfill is, a truck and people tipping that truck into a landfill, whereas you're going to have a lot more employment around taking that raw material and making it into something. You know, and we have to be clear. I mean, it's funny, we group all these things we do under the term recycling. Let me give you an example of what I'm thinking. If I go to, say, North Dakota during harvest season and I see a giant combine going down the, down the fields, I don't say, oh, look, it's making bread. But we have this very strange habit, in the U.S. especially, to say, well, when the recycling's being picked up, it's recycling. And when it goes into the smelter at the aluminum plant, it's recycling. But in fact, these are different processes and different jobs and different businesses. And I think it's very important, when we're talking about the business case for these various things, we need to divide those up. The recycling side of it, the actual putting it into the smelter, or putting it into the pulping mill, or whatever it is, I mean, there's a very decided advantage there. I mean, even in New York City, which is very, very, very expensive to do anything, go out to dinner, much less recycle, there's the tipping fee compared landfills compared to recycling, it's very much in recycling's favor. Where you start to run into problems is it's expensive to collect. That's a means of employment, but it's also a source of cost. So these are ways to think about this.
I think a lot of people in the room would probably they have responsibilities and they want to try to educate consumers. But so I live in New York City. I live in a pre-war building. Which means we don't have separate trash chutes. We have to we bag everything into one bag for recycling, and then there's the trash. And I'm a pretty reliable recycler because I have been since I was a kid, and it was ingrained in my just day-to-day practices. But I feel as a consumer very confused as to what can go in which canister in my kitchen. Now I have to have 2 big canisters, and I always think, like, is this really working? And our consumers, I guess sort of like what you were saying, John, that I feel better if I put more and more things in the recycling container, but I don't know if that actually is being recycled. Mm-hmm. And so the incentive to me is a little bit skewed.
Right. And I think, I was talking with some waste management people that people have started to realize that this idea of continually re-educating consumers. I mean, in New York, we're just constantly getting this. You put the milk cart in this, and it's presumptuous. Why is New York City expecting us all to be garbage sorters for the city? I mean, that's kind of, I look on it. You're asking us to spend our free time learning this minutia of what goes where, and I think single stream makes more sense, and that it's not the consumer's job to do that. People don't have enough time to be with their kids. Why are they spending their time, worrying about where milk jugs go? So.
Yeah.
Well, I have good news for both of you. New York's going single stream.
What?
New York's going single stream.
Right, yeah.
So problem solved.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
And that's gonna lower, it's gonna lower costs. It's gonna lower the time commitment.
Yeah.
And it's going to probably increase the rate of recycling. I mean, I think there's, you're with the New York Times. I think we probably concentrate on New York too much. I mean, it is the most expensive place in the country to recycle. I think, collections are somewhere around the range of $700 per ton. I don't think anybody comes close to that,
Yeah.
And so, I think there's, and it's not just you, but I mean, there's just rather too much focus on New York City's recycling model, whereas there's different parts of the country that are able to recycle, if not profitably, very close to profitably in the current environment. They'd be more profitable with a better commodities environment, but, it's possible to do. I mean, St. Petersburg, Florida, for example, just got curbside recycling for the first time this year, and the cost of it is $2.90 per month to the 108,000 households there. On the flip side, the sanitation department's budget is $54 million per year. So you can do the math. I mean, there's definite cost savings within there. So, it's very tantalizing to talk about New York, but I think, we have to really focus on the broader national picture.
I mean, it definitely depends where, sometimes in some places it makes a big difference. So.
Do you think, John, do you think there should be a carbon tax on recyclable materials?
I think the best way to deal with the carbon, the greenhouse impacts of garbage is this economist who I quoted, Thomas Kinnaman from Bucknell. He said you should basically have an environmental tax on trash that goes in a landfill, and it would basically be a carbon tax because that's most of what you're offsetting. And he figured that if you put a $15 a ton tax on garbage in a landfill, then that a city could decide, all right, is it worth it to us to pay that tax and put it in a landfill, or should we recycle it and save the money? And that would enable you to make a kind of rational economic decision on each kind of trash that you do too. Instead of trying to sit around and theoretically think we should recycle this, or let the market decide what it is, and let that $15 tax do it, instead of saying we're going to do 70. I mean, to me it's idiotic for a politician to sit around and say you have to recycle 75% of your, it's like saying, it's like the Soviet plan, I want people to buy 75% black socks instead of white socks. I mean, it's just, what does a politician know about how much trash should be done?
Do you think that a carbon tax is in our future?
I don't know if it's in our future. Personally speaking, I'm not opposed to it, but I don't think it necessarily solves the problem effectively as some other solutions. I think one of the things that would really help is pay as you throw. I mean, in a lot of cities, it's all you can eat buffet. Throw away as much as you like for a simple fee. Some cities have done this where you pay on the basis of what the volume of your trash or recycling is. San Francisco's been quite successful with that, and I think that's a good market-based solution. But I still believe and firmly believe that there's still a government role in this industry, that there is a compelling social and environmental and economic interest in bringing these materials into the marketplace. I mean, whether we like it or not, I personally like it. I mean, a lot of our manufacturers today are dependent upon some of this stream. If you suddenly decide we're going to end the current system of recycling, you're going to have real panic within the manufacturers. I know we have a lot of corporate folks here who are actually looking to actively, get more PET bottles into the recycling stream. If we suddenly stop collecting these things and opt, say, for a carbon tax, you're going to cause real economic disruptions, and I'm not sure that's in anybody's interest.
You mentioned the role of government, but a lot of people in the room, their role as either as a packaging manufacturer or a retailer, and they're trying to both deal with the cost of the business, but also consumer preferences. So could you talk about their role in what Jim was talking about in terms of evolving to adapt to the changes that the industry needs to do? Well,
I think one of the most exciting sort of movements within this community right now is DFR, Design for Recycling. We're actually seeing, the corporate side, the product designers actually interacting more with the recyclers. And I think government can play a really healthy role in that. And I think that's something that's in everybody's interest. I mean, if we can actually create, the corporations working with recyclers can actually create products that are part of a closed loop, that do make economic sense, everybody wins. And I think government can play a very important role in facilitating that.
John, so the 1996 article got the most hate mail.
Right.
What about the most recent article? How did that rate on the hate mail?
It got a huge amount of hate mail. I don't know that it set a record, but they ran the entire letter section. I think they ran the next Sunday. They devoted to it. Not a single positive letter either. One thing that I was going to say that as far as the government role in these new materials is what Jim was talking about with these new flexible plastic packaging. Here is where I think really the recycling religion is bad for the environment. The idea of being against these really lightweight packaging that are very inexpensive, in energy, that they're good for. It's like plastic bags. They're a net gain for greenhouse emissions, but we have these religious beliefs that they're bad. So and it's better to recycle a paper bag than. And this is where I think really, the religion gets in the way of it's both expensive and it's not good for the planet.
That's just say, it's an interesting conundrum. I mean, because these lightweight packages, they are a net greenhouse gas savings. But I don't think that means we're at a dead end here. And you're seeing organizations like the American Chemistry Council, working on packaging initiatives saying, why can't we have lightweight packaging that is also recyclable? And
it's just that it's so lightweight. Why not just put it in? I mean, it doesn't really. Like recycling a big plastic thing or cans, but to me, this stuff is so lightweight. Just sequester that carbon in the landfill.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the life cycle assessment is on like a baby food pack. I probably should, but that would be interesting to find out. What is the embedded energy in there?
Right.
I mean, is it possible to do? But I don't think it's enough, as an industry, as a society, to say, well, it is so lightweight. Let's stop looking into it. Let's look into it. Let's see. And there are organizations doing that.
Right.
And landfills have changed.
Right. I mean, to me, landfills, in the studies that have compared environmental cost of landfills and everything, what they find is, as Jim said earlier, is that the environmental benefits do not come from avoiding landfills, that there really aren't that many environmental harms from landfills. And by the way, you asked earlier who would like one next to them. I visited a guy who lives next to one, and he's happy because it's an incredible economic boon to his county. You know, they have incredible schools, and these landfills that are in rural areas, no one really lives right next door to it anyway, and they're just, you know, this landfill I visited in Virginia paid more property taxes than everyone else in the county. They had incredible new schools and with computers in every room because of that landfill. So I think in that sense, it's...
Do you want to respond to that?
Well, I mean, you know, I'm sure I can always find somebody living near the landfill who thinks it's fabulous. I mean, you know, that's.
But it's just that these counties want land. I mean, you put a landfill out in the middle of somewhere, and it's a huge economic benefit.
Right. Well, I mean,
no one wants to live next to a steel factory or anything else, but you put it in the right place.
Right. I mean, in many cases, you know, for instance, you know, if you look at a place like the Bishopville landfill in South Carolina, I mean, you know, the existence of a landfill isn't, you know, evidence of great economic planning initiatives. I mean, it's sort of, well, this is what we have available to us, you know, and you know, not everybody there is going to be happy about it. You know,
I mean, no one wants to live next to a composting facility either, so.
Let me ask you before we have about 2 minutes, so maybe I think this is a good way to end because Jim was talking a lot about the commodity prices. And where do you see that playing in the long term in the United States? I mean, how do you, it's hard to plan for that, but what do you think anyone in this room or Waste Management should be doing?
I mean, I think long term the raw materials get cheaper. The question is, I think the margin, can you automate the process enough? I mean, one reason that raw materials get cheaper is we get better and better ways of extracting it. We can extract oil now that was too inefficient to do. I can imagine in the future robots digging into landfills and mining them for materials there when you have really great new computerized systems. I think the key is to automate it and not have a lot of labor involved.
And the commodity prices are obviously a big topic of conversation, especially in the financial news. Your opinion?
Yeah. I mean, every day on Bloomberg's site, you know, there's an article there saying they're going up. There's another article saying they're going down. And what I say is, I don't know. But I will say this, you know, I was in China for 12 years during the boom, 2002 to 2014, and how many times I heard people say, this is the new normal. And you know, they were wrong. I mean, there were also people who were saying no, and they were, you know, considered contrarians. Now I'm hearing people say, well, this is the new normal. And, you know, I mean, you have to excuse my skepticism. I've sort of been there before. I think there's reasons to believe. There's some bullish reasons on the commodities front. I mean, you know, one of my favorite figures in terms of paper, and I know we have people very interested in paper recycling here, 2014, Chinese people sent 14 billion express packages. That's all related to online commerce. And online commerce in China right now is the fastest growing sector of retail. In fact, there's an estimate from the Chinese government itself saying that 83% of retail in Beijing, city of 20 million plus people, is e-commerce oriented. Well, that's going to create tremendous demand for recycled fiber. A lot of that's going to come from within China, but some of it's going to come from other places. So I think it's, you know, it's hard to say. I mean, these are very difficult phenomena to predict.
Okay, well, we know that it's difficult and it's complicated, but it's also extremely interesting. And so that is going to conclude my portion of asking questions. Now it's your turn to ask questions. And so we have about 15 minutes, and there are two people in the, on the Waste Management team that have microphones. So if you have a question for either of these gentlemen, we have a question here. Always good to be the first to get things started, so I don't have to call on you. And could you tell us where you're from?
Hi, I'm Timur. I'm Intel's Green Building Program Manager globally and Waste Program Manager. So landfills, right? On your total cost model, did you consider leachate and liability concerns? From an industrial perspective versus a local consumer, those would be part of our total cost models you look at. And in regard to the cost of landfill versus recycling, that's very myopic, right? It depends where you are in the world. Phoenix, landfill's cheap. Oregon, Portland, it's a bit more, maybe like 3 times as much. So you can have different things, but a lot of us are willing to pay more to recycle. And in regard to waste management things, I totally agree. For them to have disruptive technology, it's going to cost more. But on your total cost models and what you were talking about, did you consider the liability and leachate concerns of landfill?
Well, I haven't gotten into detail like that. I mean, I'm just looking at the cities who look like the people in, you know, New York City and other cities. When they look around, they compare the total cost. And I presume a landfill ought to be taking those costs into account and costing it. I mean, I think that you know, people who do want to pay more to recycle, I respect that, and I think that, you know, that people should be free to practice religion and do their sacraments. I don't think it should be mandatory for everyone else. And I think what Adam said about pay as you throw is a great, you know, approach, that people should pay to get rid of garbage, and if it's cheaper to have it recycled, then, you know, that they get basically, if it's cheaper if they sort it and recycle it, great, and they can make a choice. Some people want to recycle a lot, some people don't want to, and I think that's a great model.
So you're concurring that your model for cost doesn't consider groundwater contamination, et cetera?
Well, no. Well, the people who do these studies, these big, and there have been a lot of them, you know, looking at the environmental benefits and the costs, and they look into the, you know, what effect does it have on land values around the landfill? What effect does it have on that? And so they take that into account, but you know, and they just find that it isn't really that significant an impact compared with environmental impacts. I mean, there are environmental impacts of recycling facilities, you know, the composting facilities. So, I mean, they find that the major benefits, by far the major benefits of recycling are the carbon or the greenhouse impacts, not the local environmental.
Okay, well, fine. Is there a question right behind you?
I headed this one in. I'm interested in your views on extended producer responsibility. So we talk about pay-as-you-throw programs, but what about holding the producers responsible for the packaging material that they choose to distribute their materials in?
Yeah, EPR, which is it's a phenomenon that's right now, I think, primarily associated within the e-scrap field technology. And I'm a fan of it. I mean, I do think that, you know, externalities, I mean, in an ideal market, all externalities are accounted for. I like markets. And if you're going to account for all externalities, then you have to expect the producers to take responsibility for the full cost. So, you know, within the e-waste, within the appliance field, I think there's a real good argument for it. You know, there are EPRs in that field, you know, in the United States, in Europe. China actually has the world's largest one. They all have their problems. If you follow this in the e-scrap field, you know that, you know, they're still figuring these things out. In terms of plastics and in terms of packaging, you know, again, in theory, I really like the idea. Again, I think, you know, we all benefit, you know, the market benefits if externalities are all figured into the price of things. You know, the question is how you make it happen. You know, I think we have manufacturers now, a lot of manufacturers who are starting to think not so much in terms of, well, we're going to take that packaging back, but again, how do we make it more, how do we sort of grease the wheel so that they work within a circular economy context? And I'm all for that.
I would be very much opposed to it. I mean, I think that, Adam's right that you want externalities taken into account, but the way to do it is the consumer owns that garbage. It's your garbage. You should have to pay to get rid of it, and what you pay to get rid of it should reflect the externalities. I think the idea of, and I think that there are market pressures, like, you know, Amazon is offering hassle-free packaging. People don't want to get all this packaging with it, and Amazon is responding to that demand. But I think the idea of having the government basically, I'm not sure what exactly, but these ideas that manufacturers have to figure out what's going to happen with their materials, to me, it's an incredible regulatory morass, and it will stifle innovation. I mean, now you see people that they don't want to do these wonderful new flexible, lightweight plastic packages. I mean, if you have a bureaucrat in Washington saying you can't do that because I'm not sure how to recycle it, that's going to really end up stifling innovation and leave you with, I mean, we'd still be using glass milk jugs if, you know, if there's somebody there who has to approve every kind of packaging. That's my concern.
Any others? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm Dylan DeThomas of Resource Recycling Magazine. Going back to the economic argument, I was curious because you cite the high recycling costs in New York City. Can you name another city in the United States or the world that has a similar cost structure that is causing that city to quote unquote lose money on recycling?
Well, the best study that I know, when I wrote about this in the 90s, there are a lot of cities that claim that they save money on recycling. What? Well, Thomas Kinnaman, this economist who looked at these prices, and he studied them, and he studied them in Europe, he studied them here. I mean, he's found, there's a huge study that SWANA, the solid waste, did in the 90s. A lot of cities claimed they saved money on recycling. When they really did an audit, they all lost money on it. You know, Kinnaman says basically that if you put a $15 a ton tax on garbage going to a landfill, that you'd have a lot more garbage going to a landfill because people would rather pay that tax than recycle. That he says, I mean, he says, you know, it's one of the first things when a municipality has financial trouble, they want to cut back on recycling because it costs more money.
We have a question over here. We don't want to forget the wings.
There was this, it showed that organics were the third largest category in terms of greenhouse gases, but it was an economic loser. And, you know, but if you think about the volume and the weight of all of that, it's a pretty big chunk. So my question really is about this overall level of consumer confusion. I mean, every time you go into a restaurant and you see that they've got 3 bins out for landfill, for recycling, for compost, all 3 bins are horribly contaminated, and you know, maybe there's some wishful recycling. I hope this goes to a good place, right? Mm-hmm. But my question is, what is the role for media, maybe for government, but also for industry in educating people on what they can do on organics recycling in their homes? You know, if everyone were to do a little bit of composting at their house, New York apartment dwellers aside, what could that do to reduce the amount of volume overall, the amount of impact on landfills, the greenhouse gas benefits? And I would just say that my premise is that we can create new social norms. I mean, I often tell a story about growing up as a kid in the 70s with my mom driving a Ford Country Squire station wagon, you know, with a 3rd row rear-facing seat, and my brother and I would hop back and forth from the 2nd to the 3rd row and then stick our head out the rear window and ask my mom to go over bumps. And I was a smart woman, and amazing we didn't die. But now my youngest will scream if he's not in a 5-point harness with a helmet on every time we go anywhere. But it's a new social norm, right? And I think that we have a role and an opportunity that media can play, that industry can play, and that potentially government could also play in making a big difference on the organic side.
All right,
and would love your thoughts.
Thank you.
I think that the people who support organic and organic recycling, you know, have every right to try and create a new social norm. To me, the seatbelt example that you give, there's a very clear benefit of saving a kid's life. I think the benefits of organic food in general, as a science writer, you know, we science writers have this whole idea that organic is healthier is, you know, I don't think there's any evidence that it is. So I don't think the government should be promoting organic food. I don't think it should be, you know, these are values questions. If people who believe in it, it's fine for them, but I don't think it's a role for the government to make that kind of judgment call.
You want to comment on the media portion?
just really quickly. Well, let me answer it this way. You know, methane is the 3rd largest contributor to greenhouse gases in the United States. And in fact, it's a much more potent contributor than CO2. So I think we're at a point where we need to have a serious discussion as a country about, you know, what we want to do to handle methane. One of the things that's being done to handle methane is, for instance, to pipe it out of landfills. And, you know, waste management's a leader in that. But I think there's a compelling social interest in talking about methane regulation and organics. And, you know, I have to say, I haven't made up my mind on it. You know, I'm a metals guy primarily. So, you know, organics is something that I haven't thought as seriously about, but I'm certainly open to discussion. In terms of the public education component, you know, the recycling companies and local governments have done an amazing job at getting people to recycle, the religion of recycling. So I have no doubt that there is the ability to do better in terms of education, you know, in reducing contamination in particular. But if there is the social decision, the wide-based social decision that we want to do this, I'm absolutely convinced that we could get, you know, people on board using tools of public education.
All right, well, I think that sounds like a great way to wrap it up. Thank you for having us and for the panel to kick off your day. John and Adam, thank you, and we're going to leave it here. Thank you.
Dana, John, Adam, you guys are great. Thank you. Thank you. Super stuff. Really appreciate it. Great stuff. We're going to take a 30-minute break now. Give you a chance to answer some emails, check back at the office, but importantly, make sure you continue your network. This is a sustainability conference. We're trying to share ideas, follow up on questions and issues that have been raised. We'll have snacks and the like out there for you. Don't forget, if you haven't answered the question about how do you define the circular economy and want to provide the answer, we welcome it. Just drop it in at the front desk. And for our live streaming audience, we'll be back. Don't forget to tweet. And one thing that'd be good to know, what's your favorite thing about the forum so far? Use the hashtags, the same forum. We'll be back. Peter Zine's up next. Thank you.